welcome. We are at Chesnut Hill Baptist Church here in Exeter. This is actually a return trip for us to this particular resting ground. And we're looking here at the white church, which accompanies the graveyard. These are pictures that we had shown earlier, but we may as well take a closer look at the church, the Baptist church itself. This location is most famous for its cemetery and the legends that exists around one of the decedents in the cemetery here. You can see it's a church without a steeple on top there. A very beautiful, nice, quaint, rural church, and still functioning. Still have Mass every Sunday, as well as Sunday school. You'll notice there's a no parking sign here because of the attention that the cemetery has garnered. But officially, let's just mark it officially here, the sign has fallen over. But this is Historical Cemetery number 22 in the town of Exeter. You can see the sign has since fallen over since the last time we were here. Okay, so let's proceed in and talk a little bit about the history here. This is a remake of one of our videos that we did before. So this is the famous Mercy Brown Cemetery, and it's one of the final vampire cases that overtook Rhode Island in the 19th century. In particular, really it's the tragic story of George Brown, who was the father of this very large family, who systematically watched his wife and 2 daughters and a son succumb to the disease of tuberculosis and the rather ghastly fate that they suffered. So the year was 1883 when George Brown, who was just a humble farmer in the town of Exeter, his wife became ill late that year, late 1883. His wife was named Mary Eliza, and she began showing signs of a disease that was literally rampaging a lot of these rural communities, and that disease was tuberculosis, which was known as consumption. Now, tuberculosis is a particularly nasty infection, especially at the time, with no cure, in that it would literally as a wasting disease. It would cause blood in the lungs, reddening of the eyes, vomiting. It was spread through the air by particulate matter, saliva, sneezing, and it would literally just waste you away over time. You would lose weight, coughing out blood. You would appear pale as a result of that, and develop a fever, night sweats, fatigue, and it was generally known as a wasting disease. And one of the really terrible things about the disease was that it had latent effects, meaning you could be infected with it and not show symptoms right away. And so George Brown, the head of the household, watched over the course of late that year his wife, Mary Eliza, slowly succumbed to this disease. On December 8th, 1883, she died and was buried here in the Chesnut Hill Baptist Cemetery. Not much time to grieve for Mr. Brown, because his oldest daughter, Mary Olive, whose grave is located right behind her mother's, also began showing symptoms of the disease. And she grew paler, gaunt, and it was very evident that what she was suffering from was very similar. She died about 6 months later, June 6th, in fact, of 1884, so less than about 6 months after her mother died, and the second member of the family to succumb to it. She was the eldest sister here, and you can see the inscription on the bottom here, which we'll post up here. It's a little hard to read, but we'll post it up, and it's a memorial to Miss Brown here. Okay, with Mary gone, attention turned towards the older brother Edwin, he was the only son, I shouldn't say the older brother, he was the only son actually of the Brown clan, and he actually married, and he moved all the way to Wickford, and he had a farm and was developing a life there. But again, as the nature of the disease spread, and this is Edwin Brown's grave right here, and he died in 1892, and that time frame will become important here in a second. About, looking at here, a little more after 5 years after the death of his sister Mary Olive, he began showing symptoms. Again, the latent nature of the disease having an effect here. And it was a very similar type of symptoms that his mother and sister had suffered. One of the things that they noticed is he had terrible dreams, and that this is what may have spawned the investigation. Dreams of suffocation and drowning, and morning he felt as though blood had been drained from his body. This is significant because there's a spiritual belief that this disease, tuberculosis, consumption as it was known, was caused by a spiritual attack on him, and that attack became known as vampirism. So Edwin went to Colorado Springs, and a health facility there, a spa to help regain his vitality, his health, and it actually seemed to work, and the progress of the disease slowed over the course of those years. And say 5 years after Mary Olive, we're talking about 1889 or so, and it slowed enough that then he was able to actually believe that the treatment was working. Now, he was pulled out of his respite there in Colorado when his youngest sister, Mercy Lena, they called her Lena, suddenly came down with the disease. And Mercy's stone is over here. So Mercy Brown was the fourth member of the family afflicted with consumption, tuberculosis. And when she came down with the disease, that's when Edwin decided to come back home. His condition rapidly deteriorated as a result of the news, perhaps due to the stress of the situation. The fact that another one of his sisters was dying of the disease, and he quickly came back. When he arrived, he learned that his sister, in fact, had died. You can see January 17th, 1892. When she died, the ground was sufficiently frozen so that she couldn't be buried right away. In fact, she had to be interred in the crypt, the above ground crypt known as the keep, and that's really important. So, within a few years, George Brown had been bereft, and I'm reading here right from the Providence Journal of March 19th, 1892. Just a few months after Mercy died, George Brown had been bereft of wife and two daughters by the dreaded disease consumption. His wife, Mary Eliza, was first stricken down 8 years prior, leaving her husband and 6 children basically alone. Within 2 years of the mother's disease, Olive died of the same disease, Mary Olive leaving the other members of the family apparently in good health. Within a few years, Edwin, who was employed as a clerk in G.T. Cranston and by Taylor and Davis of Lafayette, was taken ill, and by advice of friends, he was taken out to Colorado Springs. For about 18 months he was away. But during the absence, Mercy Lena, who appeared in good health at the time of his departure, became sick and passed away after just a few months of suffering. She died at the age of 19. Edwin's health suffered immediately. He began failing so rapidly he came back to Rhode Island, and he laid in the house of his father-in-law, Wills Himes. Remember, Edwin was married during this time. So that's where the story is centered. And Mr. Brown actually became, so I'm reading here, so I pan back from the family resting place. He became besieged by a number of people who really believed in that old theory that the dead were feasting on the living, meaning that this disease was a spiritual attack. In some unexplained and unreasonable way, in some part of the deceased relative's body, life, flesh, and blood may be found, which is supposed to feed on the living who are in enfeebled health. Meaning that those who had died of the disease were now, their spirits were the cause of the spreading of the disease, and that their body should be examined. So George Brown didn't believe in these stories, and he was very reluctant, and he had no confidence in these old-time theories. And he didn't get much help from the medical industry, and he did eventually yield to an investigation just to either prove or disprove these old-time theories. So they employed a man named Harold Metcalf of Wickford, a very skilled doctor. He was a medical examiner of the district. He was a graduate of Bellevue and grew up in Providence. And so he enlisted him to come in and check it out. And unfortunately, this was another case where science apparently let down, let down common sense. So what they did was they, exhumed the bodies of Mary Eliza, Mary Olive, and they looked for signs of decomposition. This is what Metcalf was interested in seeing. And what he noticed was that they both showed sign of normal decomposition. Mary died and was buried immediately in December, and Mary Olive was buried in June. So because that they were buried, and at least in the case of Mary Olive, she was buried in a warm part of the New England season. They show natural decomposition, growth of hair and fingernails, no pooling up of blood. And as a result of this, they were ruled out as candidates for this type of spiritual attack that had been theorized against the family. But then the question turned to Mercy. Now, Mercy was still alive when Edwin first began suffering from the attacks. And when the investigation began, her body was still lying in state, so to speak, in this crypt, which is located down from the cemetery here. There's an individual watching me. That's fine. And so what ended up happening was they focused the investigation on her. Metcalf wanted to know whether or not she was the cause of it. So they came down here and they performed an autopsy. And what Metcalf found was evidence that that perhaps this spiritual explanation had some teeth to it, some benefit to it, had some truth to it. Found blood welling up in the heart. Found that she didn't have the normal stages of decomposition. Her body looked more pristine, I should say, than it actually was. It hadn't decomposed as much as it should have. The natural explanation is that her body had been laid above ground, was exposed to very cold temperatures, and as a result, those temperature effects had slowed the rate of decomposition. Fortunately, Dr. Metcalf didn't take these factors into account, so he immediately ordered an old-fashioned type of remedy in the tradition of what people did in Europe, and that essentially meant opening up the victim, removing the heart, removing the lungs, moving internal organs, and grinding them up and mixing them with herbs as a part of a treatment to be used to feed those that were afflicted. And there's some conflicting testimony here of whether or where this was done. The idea was that there were a number of rocks and that the organs and blood were ground up and mixed with herbs on one of these rocks here. I've seen a number of other online investigations which claimed that, in fact, one of these rocks was the one used. This is not something that can be verified in any particular way. But nevertheless, Mercy Brown's body was pulled out of the crypt, and this autopsy and gutting of her body was immediately undertaken. So I'm reading right here from the Providence Journal. The body of Lena, the second daughter, was removed from the tomb where it had been placed till spring. The body was in a fairly well-preserved state. It had been buried 2 months. The heart and liver were removed, and cutting open the heart, clotted and decomposed blood were found, which was what might be expected at that stage of decomposition. The liver, though, showed no blood, though it was in a well-preserved state. These organs were removed, and a fire being kindled in the cemetery, they were reduced to ashes, and the attendants seemed satisfied. The lungs showed diffuse tuberculosis germs. The old superstition of the natives of Exeter, and also believed in other farming communities, is either a vestige of the black art, or the people living here say is a tradition of the Indians. So the claim was that these old-fashioned remedies came from the Indians, although there is evidence that these old remedies actually came from European origin. And the belief is that as long as the heart contains blood, so long will any of the immediate family who are suffering from consumption continue to grow worse. So if there's blood in the heart, people in the family will continue to get sick. But if the heart is burned, then the patient will get better. And that's what they did. It was the ritual that they did. And to make the cure certain, the ashes, heart, and liver should be eaten by the person afflicted. In this case, the doctor does not know if the latter remedy was resorted to or not, and he only knows from hearsay how ill Edwin is, never having been called to attend him. So the actual ritual itself wasn't conducted by the doctor, but he examined, and based on his findings, the town decided that they were going to enact this old traditional form of remedy on Edwin. We'll come back to the term. Now, Edwin didn't survive. This rather ineffective treatment didn't work, and he succumbed to his illness very soon after. There's no evidence at all that Mercy Brown was attacking him. There's no evidence at all that she was rising from the grave and draining her brother as he lived. In fact, she became ill after he did. So one of the more natural questions is, how was she the source of his illness if she was alive? In fact, showed no symptoms before he did. Edwin would seem a more obvious suspect if the living, in fact, could launch spiritual attacks. But again, this is all a matter of conjecture in the sense that we know what the cause was. It was the latent effect of tuberculosis, which spread through this family right here. So here's Edwin Brown, died in May of 1892. Reading that very closely here because I can't quite read the date on it. And in relation to his sister, there's Mary Olive. She died 1884. Mercy died January 17th, 1892. So you can see that the legend of Mercy Brown as the last Rhode Island vampire has brought people here. There's a dream catcher. And there used to be a little placard here saying that she wasn't a vampire, but she haunts the cemetery. But people nevertheless have left, as we've seen in other graves of Paul Revere, have left little statues. In fact, there's even a little skeleton here that somebody has left behind. We'll put that on her. But she was a 19-year-old girl who, unfortunately, because of the age that she lived in, the lack of medical treatment available, died from a very common disease, one that would kill quite a number of well-known people. Molière, Voltaire, W.C. Fields, Erwin Schrödinger, Charles IX, Eleanor Roosevelt died from tuberculosis, Napoleon II, Keats, Lawrence, Eugene O'Neill, Chopin, John Calvin, Immanuel Kant. I'm just reading down this list here. It's a terribly destructive disease. So this is a beautiful cemetery, I should say. A lot of beautiful plants here. You can see some beautiful, well, those are fake, but right up, and the last thing I want to show you here is right leading up to the path. Oh, I'm going the wrong way. Right leading up to the path of, sorry to step over those stones there. bit of bad luck. Right, leading up to the path to Mercy Brown's family plot here. There's these beautiful purple flowers. There's a guy who's going to mow the lawn here. That's what he's doing. You can see just how beautiful they are. Look at that. Heading straight to where she's lying. And I almost tripped on a rock, so take care of that. So this is devilshopyard.com, exploring the myth of the Mercy Brown case of vampirism, and I think it was the last, if I'm not mistaken, case of vampirism in Rhode Island.